Illegally Deaf is a podcast about overcoming obstacles. I'm Danny Burnside, and just this year, I was diagnosed with severe hearing loss. Oh, did I mention I'm a professional Hollywood voice actor? Funny how that goes. I've made the decision to own my disability and interview remarkable guests who are thriving in light of being disabled. Welcome to the Illegally Deaf podcast. How you doing, Jordan?
I probably feel better than I look at the minute. It's the start of the holidays for the little ones.
I love your dialect. Jordan, would you consider your dialect a standard Scottish dialect, or is that more of a regional dialect?
I've moved around a lot in my life, so my dialect's probably a mixture of a couple of places, mainly Edinburgh, but we live more Highland-based now in Perth, which is classed as the Highlands and Islands.
That's absolutely beautiful, for real. The beautiful voice.
Thank you very much.
Have you ever heard the name Burnside before? Because from what I've been told, the origins of the name Burnside is Scottish.
Not Burnside, but I'd imagine it is Scottish, for obvious reasons being the Rabbie Burns connection.
Right.
But also a lot of like small cities and areas in Scotland normally end with side.
I do have Scottish ancestry, obviously, many, many, many generations ago. But what I was told is that, yes, there is a coat of arms floating around somewhere, and that perhaps they did, the clan, the Burns clan or whatever, perhaps they did reside on the side of a river or a creek, and that's kind of where the Burnside name came from. Now, maybe that's a fairy tale, maybe it's true, Jordan. I have no idea.
It sounds true to me. A burn is what we used to call, like a wee river. We'd go down the burn. You're probably not far off. I've got a lot of ancestors that moved from central Scotland over to Chicago, like in the 1800s. So who knows?
Well, we might be related. Who knows, Jordan? Somewhere down the road, you know. We named my daughter, actually, it's a Scottish name, Elspeth. Are you familiar with the name Elspeth?
Yes.
Yeah, so that's my daughter's name, even though my wife, I mean, here we are. I am American, my wife is Chinese, and our daughter's name is Elspeth. Welcome to the 21st century.
Oh, it's a lovely name.
For the listeners that don't know, it's the Scottish variation of the name Elizabeth.
Ah, that's lovely. I have two daughters, Kenna and Freya.
Wonderful.
We also went for quite traditional Scottish names.
It's great being a dad, isn't it?
Being a dad's been my absolute calling. I love it.
Okay, so real quick, before we jump in, you got to tell me about this tattoo on your right arm.
I've always been a fan of animation since I was a kid, and one of the fondest sort of childhood core memories I have is coming home and watching Toonami and catching Dragon Ball Z. It was like my favourite thing growing up. And my favourite movie from Dragon Ball Z is the Future Trunks movie. When I decided to get my first tattoo, this is my first legitimate tattoo. I do have a secondary first tattoo, but that's a different decision. This tattoo was my first proper tattoo. And I got Trunks on my arm from Dragon Ball, or one of the key moments from the series. And I absolutely love it.
Okay, be honest. What does your wife think about it?
She loves it.
Great.
I mean, it could have gone either way. I have a tattoo, secondary, the original first, of a guitar on my leg, on my right leg. And I got that done when I was 15, I think. I was at a wedding in Poland. We snuck off and found a tattoo parlour with somebody who couldn't understand what I was saying, and I couldn't understand them. We just knew that I wanted a guitar on my leg. It's not great. That's the tattoo she's not happy with.
This is hilarious, man. You snuck off from a wedding to get a tattoo. I love this.
It was a terrible idea because I didn't realise how painful it was going to be. I think I might have had some alcohol in my system at the time.
Perhaps.
So I think that made the pain worse.
And then have you heard about this rumor of this Dragon Ball Z theme park that's going to be built in Saudi Arabia?
Yes.
You and the family might have to take a trip out to the desert at some point here. All right, so guys, my guest today joined the Royal Military Police. It's a branch of the British Army in 2016. He was mentally abused by a police officer in charge, or an officer in charge, leading to a PTSD diagnosis and subsequent medical discharge in 2019. To top it all off, he had a baby on the way, his firstborn. So thus began a period of confusion and anxiety, such as what am I going to do with my life? What am I going to do for work? Combined with his own disability denial. After winning a settlement against the Ministry of Defense for his injuries, he took a leap of faith into an industry not often associated with the military. Voice acting. Honored to have you on the show, sir, Mr. Jordan McNaught.
Thank you very much for having me here, and how eloquently put.
Did I pronounce the last name correctly? McNaught? That's pretty much how you would say it?
Yeah, that's pretty spot on. it can be a tricky one to get.
And you got any history for that last name? Any fun knowledge about its origins or anything?
So I know the original tartan. So me and my wife for our wedding, we had a hand fasting. Reference-wise, there's a scene in Braveheart, funnily enough, where they do a hand fasting ceremony. It's quite traditional, where you take the tartan from each clan and you tie it in a ceremony, and thus your clans become one.
And I do remember the scene. It's a wonderful film.
Yeah, I do have a soft spot for the film. It's up there as one of my favourites. My wife's tartan, she was, at the time, Victoria Wallace.
We're talking about William Wallace here, right? Is she related to Braveheart?
Yeah, probably. Her Scottish ancestry does go quite far back. Mine's so McNaught is a newer clan. It's derived from McKnight. McKnight means son of knight, I believe. The McNaught branch came from there. And from there, we sort of settled in the central belt of Scotland, so mainly like Edinburgh.
Mm-hmm.
Another section came off from that, and those are the guys that went over to the US.
Well, I got to be honest, in addition to your wonderful story that we're going to get into, just your dialect is enough to get on this show. I really love the way you speak. It's just beautiful.
Thank you. I do normally have to slow it down. I get carried away. Please rein me in.
Okay, and do the same for me, because sometimes I get ahead of myself and talk a mile a minute, but that's when I'm enjoying the conversation.
Yeah. Aye, that's no problem.
I always learned I guess I learned it in performing arts school, whether it's right or not. I learned it that a dialect is when it's the same origin language. For example, Jordan and I are both speaking English, so to my ear, he's speaking a dialect of English. To his ear, I'm speaking a dialect of English, because we're both native English speakers, whereas an accent would be a non-native speaker speaking your language or a foreign tongue. For example, perhaps someone who's German, if that individual was speaking English with Jordan and I, that individual would have an accent. I don't know. I thought that was kind of interesting to learn. So you and I are speaking in dialects with one another.
I mean, yeah, you probably know far more than I do. My background for performing arts is practically nil.
Let's get into that. Let's talk about just your childhood. Maybe you weren't an artist, but did you play sports? Like, what were you doing as a kid?
I've had this conversation with a lot of my US colleagues in terms of sort of acting and drama and things like that growing up. So I grew up in a place called Niddrie, which is a notorious estate in Edinburgh for its crime and sort of poverty. Me and my mother and my grandfather, we lived there. And it's not the sort of place that's welcoming for drama and musicians. It's very much a homebred council estate where labour is key. Everyone's going to be a bricklayer, everyone's going to work with wood, that sort of thing. And so my school, Castlebrae Community High School, was underfunded, understaffed, and unfortunately we just didn't have the options growing up. That's not to say that I had a terrible childhood, but I definitely feel, speaking with my wife, who went to private school when she was younger, and speaking to a lot of friends, that I definitely missed out on a lot of options that perhaps might have been key or provided different opportunities when I came into adulthood.
Well, the really, really cool thing about the arts is you really can always come back and revisit the arts. You know, it's not like being a professional athlete where your window of opportunity is very, very limited. I mean, let's be real. I'm 41. There's no way I'm going to now become a professional athlete. I mean, it's just not going to, even if I started training 10 hours a day. That's a really cool thing about the arts. Your shelf life is till the day you die. So maybe you weren't involved in the arts as a kid, but what kind of activities did you enjoy doing? What kind of hobbies did you have when you were very young?
I did a lot of music. Guitar and singing is something I did sort of quietly. It wasn't something I did out in the open. It's going to seem dark, but unfortunately, I spent most of my time fighting. Fighting was huge when I was a kid. It was normal to me until I became an adult and heard things from other people who had perhaps never been punched before in their life. You know, it was almost alien to me. So activities-wise, boxing, you almost had to study boxing or study a martial art just in case.
What a beautiful juxtaposition, beautifully tragic, but of you having to be a tough fighter in public, but in private, playing guitar and singing. What an interestingly beautiful image.
It was tough. It's something that I think not a lot of people talk about in these smaller estates. It's not widely known. Places in the UK are known for being rough, just like there's places in the US that are a bit more rough and tumble than others.
Sure.
I don't think people understand the effects that it really does have on kids of those generations growing up. You're basically fighting tooth and nail every day just to get a normal education.
You then are about to graduate high school or whatever the equivalent is. Why did you decide at that time to pursue a career in the military? Did you come from a military family?
Yes, so my stepfather was a Royal Marine, and so he spent a lot of time coming back and forward from Iraq and Afghanistan. I started to understand the military for the first time properly, but also understood the emotional impact it was having on me and my family. We'd be waiting for a phone call sometimes. We'd hear something on the news, and we'd wait for a phone call, and the phone call was either going to be a good phone call or the worst phone call we were going to receive. I could see that emotional impact and the things that happened to the family, but I also seen the positives that it brought at the time. I think that planted a seed in my head of what I wanted to do with my life, a channel of focus. We moved from Scotland down to a place called Blackpool, which is a seaside town in England, and from there I worked in a lot of nightclubs and things like that. I think, just exploring my late teenage years, I think as most folk do, partying and nightclubs and all that sort of work in. And eventually I just decided, this is the time now. So I began to train quite extensively in preparation to join the army. The base entry was something like a 1.5 mile run in 10 minutes 30. And I timed my first run, just set a baseline, and I think it was something crazy like 25 minutes.
Wow, you had to shed a lot down.
Yes, so I was like, oh, okay, we've got work to do. I did the work, got my placement. I think it took about a year in total to train and also get my placement, pass the entrance exams, and then be selected for the military police. I scored high enough on my scores that was an option for me.
Could you kind of explain to our listeners what exactly is the Royal Military Police?
So the RMP, or the Royal Military Police, are a sub-branch of the AGC, which is a larger branch of the British Army. We deal with a lot of logistics, sort of inner squabbles within the army. If there's an army base, we will deal with crime there, but anything outside of the base is generally dealt with civilian police force. Day-to-day jobs for us would include things like traffic issues within the camps, if somebody had gone AWOL, absent without leave. We did army stuff as well, so we did a lot of training for getting deployed to Estonia. Things were heating up over there. Military stuff in terms of rifle handling, pistol handling, that sort of thing. But our main focus was policing activities on camp.
You've said that you enjoyed your time serving.
Yeah, I did. I spent a long time thinking about it, whether it was growing up or training. Put a lot of time and a lot of focus into this thing. And so when it was finally there, and I was good at it, it's one of those careers for me where I'd got to a point where, I could say my family was proud.
What series of events happened that changed that course for you?
I passed my training, which is in 2 parts. You do phase 1, which is mainly military-esque things, combat, out in the woods, that sort of stuff. For military police, we do a phase 2, which involves our police training, whether it's handcuff techniques or understanding law, how to interview a suspect. And from there I passed, did really well. Went to my unit, which is your first sort of deployment, and that was in Scotland, in a place called Lookers, which is directly beside St Andrews. So it's a lovely place. And I don't know what set it off, but I described it as an officer, but the person involved isn't really an officer. They're called a Staff Sargent. He's somebody that's aspiring to be an officer or a sergeant major. He's still within that rank. And they just took a disliking to me. I don't know what happened, but I joined this unit and this individual took a disliking to me. From there, slowly but surely made my life hell. Really psychologically damaging. Ringing up the police station phone and asking for me personally, sending me on a mission to go up to whatever building to come see him face to face, only to find out that he's not there. And that seems silly to anybody else listening. This was happening 3-4 times a day.
Jeez.
So it started to play on my mind a little bit. That was the start. I was like, okay, what's going on here? I think it got to a boiling point. I don't know, maybe he had got tired of playing around. But it got to a boiling point, and I was called in because my hair was getting a little bit long, which is fine. I understand protocol, and your hair has to be at a certain length at all times on camp so that you're neat and proper. The time, however, I was called in, all the hairdressers are closed. All the barber shops are closed. It's 5, 6 in the evening. There's nowhere open. And he tells me to do it myself. Go and cut your hair yourself with a shaver. I go to my room because there's no facilities to cut your hair. I started cutting at my hair. And I was doing an awful job at it because I'm not a hairdresser or a barber for that matter, and I was doing a terrible job. I asked some people to try and help me, and, they're not hairdressers either, so there wasn't much they could do. I went back, and he had gone home. Somebody else was left there and just explained to me that my hair was in an awful state, and that if I didn't have it fixed by the next again day, I was going to get a thing called an agai. Now, an agai is like a formal punishment, and if you receive more than a couple of agais within a small period of time, it leads to like a more formal charge. Sometimes it can lead to prison within the army.
Jeez.
So, it becomes serious quite quick. So that night I went home, I cried in my car to my wife on the drive home because I was devastated. I didn't understand it was like somebody else was in control. I didn't understand what I was doing wrong, but something was going wrong and I didn't know how to stop it. I eventually get home and I asked my wife, look, there's nowhere open. You're going to have to try and help me cut my hair. And we've got no shaving implements other than a couple of, I think we had Bic razors. And so she tried to fix my hair. She did the best she could. And when I came in the next again day for work, feeling maybe yesterday was a bad day, maybe today will be better, I was called into the office by the sergeant major, who described me as a rapist, as a sexual offender. I'm not somebody that the public would trust with a haircut like that I looked mentally ill. And I think that was maybe breaking point part one, was where I'd done all that was asked for me, and somehow it still went wrong. That was point one. Sorry if it gets too dark.
No, it's good, Jordan. I love that. We really appreciate your willingness to open up.
I've told the story a couple of times to friends and family and other people in the same situation. And unfortunately, in the British Army, it's more common than you think for this sort of thing. But yeah, so that was point number one. And it was in a really short period, maybe like a week to 2 weeks of that haircut incident. A couple of the guys took me out to lunch on camp. So we have like a bar and grill on camp. If you went there for lunch, it was fine. So we went there to grab a bite to eat. And because I was already kind of feeling insecure, I didn't want to take my beret off. I didn't want people to see my haircut and think all these things that I had just been named. And unfortunately, an officer didn't like that, who was in the canteen, and told me to remove it. When I removed my cap, my beret, and he seen my hair, he stood me up in front of his entire squadron and berated me in front of them, describing me as the worst soldier he had ever seen, while all his squadron laughed, pointed and laughed. That sort of moment there has had such a detrimental impact to my confidence. As my therapists have described it, it's an extreme feeling of shame that I carry with me, which, has turned into PTSD.
Boy, when it rains, it pours.
Yeah, it didn't stop. This was a bowling ball. It just kept adding and adding. Every kind of small thing that I messed up on would turn into a big thing because I was so terrified of what was happening. It was like the universe was openly against me in my head. That's how I felt. I couldn't sleep, I wasn't eating, and I think the turning point for my wife, I remember, it's a good thing she's not in the room because she'd be crying. I remember driving home from camp one night and I phoned my mum first and I told her I loved her. She asked if I was okay and I explained some things that had happened. And then I phoned my wife and told her that I was going to take the car off the road. I'd had enough at that point. And thankfully I didn't. And I went home to my wife and she's looked after me ever since.
Wow.
It's hard to see something that you've loved and really worked hard for completely crumble in a matter of weeks. And there's nothing you can do to stop it.
Jordan was interviewed for a publication that he sent me the interview and I read it. And this small little excerpt really stood out to me, Jordan. Quote, "The thing about the Army is that it's all eggs in one basket kind of deal. That's the contract. So when that basket breaks and you're left with yolk on your hands, or in my case, PTSD, what direction are you supposed to follow?" I felt like that was really powerful, Jordan.
Thank you. It's exactly how I feel. And I felt like that for a long time. When I was finally discharged after a lengthy battle with the Army, I was finally discharged, medically discharged. However, the Army discharged me with embitterment, which was the medical term for being bitter.
Hilarious.
Yeah. So, it's the British Army's way of not wanting to fork out any money,
right,
essentially.
Right.
Shortly after that, I was diagnosed with PTSD by doctors in civilian street, the civilian world. That diagnosis was like, It was a mixture of a breath of fresh air, but also, well, what now? Like, am I broken? Can I be fixed? How am I going to support my family and this baby that's on the way? And then, God, I think I had to do therapy and things for a long time to begin with, just to get back to normal life. And then COVID hit, which turned everybody's world upside down. And so I didn't have a job. The world was dying before our eyes. I had a baby just about to be born. I didn't know what to do.
You experienced some disability denial. Were you in denial of that PTSD diagnosis?
I don't think I was in denial about the diagnosis. I understood what the doctor was telling me. I was denying that I was disabled. I would constantly try and do things that would trigger me and trigger my PTSD because I felt like I could still do them. And so I was in denial about it. I was in denial about being disabled. I seen it as a negative connotation. I'd been brought up to think so, whether it was in these rough areas that I'd been brought up or even in the military. Like, once you're disabled, that's it, you're broken. You're tossed to the wayside because you're not of any use anymore.
And your disability was an invisible disability.
It was an invisible disability that was caused by the military, but not in the way that people immediately think. So if I tell somebody I'm ex-military and I have PTSD, people immediately go, oh, so you served in Afghanistan or you served in Iraq. And I'm like, no, I can't relate to how your pain is with PTSD because my pain come from somewhere different. And I have connected with soldiers in certain groups and charities. There's a discourse between us because they can't understand why I also have PTSD from bullying, essentially, when their PTSD comes from being blown up. It took me a really long time to understand that things like PTSD or any sort of trauma that people go through, PTSD is caused because that is the worst experience that you have ever encountered. There's not a bar for everyone that once you hit that point, that's it, you've got PTSD. But it's the worst experience that you've ever had. And it took me a long time to understand that.
That's a really, really important distinction. And I think that it's important also to mention that it's not a competition, is it?
No. Nobody wins for having worse PTSD. We're all people who have PTSD or any sort of trauma.
I think that vibe kind of exists in the disabled community. I'm just going to come right out and say it. Like, I'm definitely not the expert on this. I'm not the authority on this whatsoever. I'm relatively new to the community, but from what some folks that I've spoken to who are longtime members of the disabled community have kind of filled me in that there is a little bit of one-upsmanship to be found. Well, my experience is worse than yours, so I don't know what you're complaining about. We got to support each other, not compete against each other.
Whether we like to believe it or not, you're already at a disadvantage. And that's just the reality of it, that you're already at a disadvantage. So why would you put yourself at further disadvantage by distancing yourself from your own community?
Okay, so it's the middle of COVID. You're definitely down in the dumps at a low point, physically and mentally. Yeah. So what happens next?
During all this time, I'd been in a legal battle with the MOD, and I feel like I'm okay to talk about it without obviously going into details, but they settled with me outside of court through my solicitor after a sort of lengthy legal battle and witnesses, etc. They provided me a settlement fee, which was to cover what my military experience would have equated to, plus damages caused. And after a lot of back and forward between my solicitor and their team, we finally agreed on a number, which wasn't great. It wasn't terrible. It was something that was going to support me and my family, but I felt disgusted taking it. I felt dirty taking it because I was fighting the fight, taking it to the MOD, and I was showing them that I'm not going to stand for this and I'm going to stand up for people who have been in the same situation. And then they offered me money and I took it. And that made me feel dirty for a long time. The world was on its head and I had to look after my family. So we took the money. I think we did what everyone probably would do, and we booked a Disney holiday.
Hilarious.
Yeah, unfortunately, a thing with PTSD is erratic spending. It's a symptom.
Interesting. I did not know that.
It's quite a common ADHD trait, and they kind of cross over between the two. So my wife has severe ADHD, and I had PTSD at the time, just diagnosed. And neither of us realised how erratic our spending would be, unfortunately. But once we had calmed down a little bit and we'd got it out of our system, we needed a game plan. We realised I couldn't work in public. I couldn't take public transport. I found it really hard to work with others who were in a higher position than me. I'm not sure what you would call it in the US, but just getting told off, getting scolded. I can't handle that anymore. Whether it's somebody beeping at me from their car or, any sort of conflict is an immediate breakdown for me. So we understood that I couldn't work under somebody like that.
I'm actually really glad you mentioned just the honking at someone from the car or the beeping at someone from the car, because we're all guilty of doing that. I've done that out of frustration. I'm not really a road rage guy, but I've honked at people. And sometimes you got to just remember, we really don't know what's going on with the person we're beeping at or honking at. Someone once told me, if that was your grandma in the car, would you be honking at them and flipping them off? If it was your grandma, no, you wouldn't be doing that.
Yeah, exactly. Everyone's going through something. But I also understand that we're human and we get annoyed. When somebody's driving 20 miles under the speed limit, tempers rise. So, I get it from that perspective as well. I think the PTSD thing's all is being about balance, finding an understanding of how I feel and an understanding of how somebody else is coming across.
Understanding. That's a really great term, Jordan. Just extending our understanding to someone else.
Yeah, it takes a lot to, especially as an adult, to just take that moment and think. We can get inside our own heads quite a lot and our own frustrations. So yeah, we got the money. We realised I couldn't work for people. I couldn't work in stores and things like that. And I tried to do delivery things for a while because I was kind of on my own. But we realised that the time brackets for doing delivery services was a trigger. I was worried that I was going to be told off because I was late for a delivery or, something like that. We started planning out things that I enjoy. I enjoy music. I couldn't make a career out of that at this point. I enjoy watching TV. What do I enjoy watching TV? Well, I've loved animation since I was a kid. And as I've grown into adulthood, I've still enjoyed a lot of those shows and more adult takes on shows. I've always had a love for Japanese anime and manga and the stories that they tell. And I thought, well, what can I do there that could pay us money, but also send me in a fulfilling direction for another career? That I wasn't broken and that I could do this. And voice acting was that point.
I get the same high doing voiceover than I used to get on stage doing theater productions.
Wow.
And it's not about the money. If you know anything about theater, it's not about the money because you're not making any.
I've heard.
I'm going to ask you two questions back to back because they're related. First one is, knowing what you know now, would you still enroll in the military in 2016? And the follow-up question is, how does your experience in the military assist you as an artist?
I would definitely join the military again. Did you ever see the film The Butterfly Effect?
Yes, I believe I did.
Fantastic. I've always had a feeling that if I ever had an opportunity to go back in time, regardless of how painful it would be, I'd have to do things the same way because I wouldn't have my wife and my daughters here. I wouldn't be where I am now. And secondly, what has the military provided me? An ability to speak. I have no issue with speaking in public. I've always been told that I take direction really well, and that's a military thing.
You were also quoted as saying that being a dad helped you see your inner child once again. And I think acting is tapping into our inner child in a lot of ways. Can you explain what you meant about being a dad helped you see or realize your inner child once again?
Yeah, so I used to do this thing when my eldest, Kenna, was really small. When she started walking, we used to do this gorilla thing, like Andy Serkis, mocap suit, Planet of the Apes style. We would just mess around like that. I would have always been focused on what people thought pre-child. When you see the happiness in a kid's face, your kid's face, when you're just playing pretend, there's nothing else like it. It's the most pure reaction to performance I think there is. Because if they don't like it, well, you'll know about it. And if they think it's the funniest thing on earth, you'll be doing it again for hours.
It's so true. They are the best judges and critics, aren't they? 100% honest.
Yeah, the harshest.
They are. They
the
are.
harshest critic.
Yes, they are. How has experiencing PTSD changed the way you view fatherhood?
There's a lot more self-reflection that I want to pass on about understanding your own feelings and it's okay to be angry, but you have to control that. Or it's okay to be upset. If you're going to be upset or you're going to grieve, do it, but don't stay there. Brush yourself off and try and get back up. And that's what I want for my girls. My wife does a fantastic job. She's always done a fantastic job of looking after me and now looking after our girls. So I think from PTSD, self-care. Self-care is the biggest thing.
That's something I remind myself very often, Jordan. Self-care. It could be as simple as shampooing and conditioning your hair. I mean that. I don't mean that trivially. That's self-care. Even though it's kind of annoying to do that sometimes, like, I really don't want to do that right now, but that's self-care. And also accepting ourselves is also self-care. And accepting the journey that we've been on is self-care. Acceptance is self-care.
You need to take time to reflect, and it's not always going to be good. There's a lot of times where you'll reflect and you'll think, God, I was an ass. And you have to kind of take ownership and accept that. You know, sometimes I think maybe you could have done things differently. That's all just part of your growth. And if you don't take that time to self-reflect, you're going to burn out eventually.
Being kind to yourself, even when you know you were an ass, when you're reflecting upon your exhibit of being an ass, you're still kind to yourself and you're focusing on growth.
Absolutely.
I think breaking the cycle is one of the strongest things we can do. A lot of folks have come from a traumatic childhood. Breaking the cycle is so powerful. And it sounds like you're providing an upbringing for your girls that in some ways is breaking the cycle that you went through. You grew up in a very tough situation. You are providing options and insights for your girls that breaks that cycle.
Yes, there's quite a few generations of us now that have experienced, like you said, a lot of trauma or a lot of difficulties growing up. Sometimes it's nobody's fault. You know, that's just how the cards were dealt. But we have a choice now. We don't have to follow that same path, or we don't have to allow our kids to go down that same path. I want my girls to have every opportunity I never had, which I think every parent wants. We have to put things in place to make sure that happens.
What do your military friends think about your life as an artist?
If I'm being honest, I don't speak to a lot of them anymore. When I was going through things, a lot of people distanced themselves from me. And then afterwards, when the diagnosis came through, a lot of people kind of just sneered at it, you know, like, oh, come on, you know, you're playing this up for money kind of thing. And I wish that was the case. You know, I wish I didn't have to live with that for a long time. And even now, still affects me to this day. There's a couple of friends who went through similar situations in that they left the military with a bad taste in their mouth. And those are the guys I still talk to. Those are the guys that went off to do photography, or I think one became a pilot. Those are the guys that I'll still talk to.
Can you speak on relapse a little bit? You know, relapsing really is part of recovery. Have you experienced relapse recently, and how do you deal with that when you find yourself falling down that hole of relapsing?
I have experienced relapse a couple of times. Unfortunately, I do think it's part of your kind of growth, whether it's your disability or your affliction. I think like everybody's going to go through them, but I guess more recently, I was at a game event for voiceover last year in London. I was booked in to do an intensive with Tom Keegan. It was like a 2-day intensive for performance capture. And I was so excited. This is going to be amazing. I'm going to learn so much. I don't have an acting background. I've never been to art school or done drama. I'm going to, you know, really dive into this head first. And unfortunately, like, the reality set in that I would have to travel from Scotland to London. I would have to drive because I can't take public transport. I have to bring my wife and children with me because my wife is my carer and I can't be without her for like too long of a period. And I started to get like overwhelmed. But we pushed through. And when we arrived in London for the event, I remember talking about my trauma within the group. And when it came to acting, I just froze. For the first day, I froze. When I got back to the hotel to my wife, I just fell into her arms and I was a mess. I didn't want to go back. I didn't want to see anybody. The fear set in that everybody's seen me as this weird, disabled PTSD weirdo who cries in front of people. That fear just snowballed. And that's the relapse hitting. That's all the progress you've worked for and built up, and these barriers that you've erected to keep your life stable, it falls apart in an instant. So from there, I think the most important thing you can have in a relapse is a support network. I don't mean a friend that may message you occasionally. I mean somebody you can just cry with is probably the best one. Just have a cry. Get it all out.
Sounds like you are very, very blessed to have your wife in your life.
She is fantastic. I do hold it over her head that I've saved her life once after she had her second. Yeah, she had a postpartum hemorrhage at home, and I managed to stop the bleeding before the ambulance arrived.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so I don't let her forget that. We've got trophies, but she's been fantastic, and I mean it when I say that I wouldn't be here without her.
What would you say to a listener of this show who is experiencing fear and denial for their own invisible illness? What would your advice be to that person?
You have to understand that it's going to be a disadvantage initially, but there is such a strong sense of community of people out there that you can speak freely with, that you don't have to be ashamed about your disability. And also, you don't have to tell everyone. If you don't want to tell somebody, it's none of their business. It's your business. It's your affliction. It's your disability. How you want to interact with people is completely your choice. But just remember that there is always community out there, and there's always people open to talking.
Well, Jordan, it's been an honor having you on, and thank you for talking, my friend.
No, thank you for having me on. And I'm sorry if I've really darkened your mood today. So I hope you can go and have a lovely cup of coffee after this.
I mean it to the core of my being, Jordan, that type of honesty is exactly what we're going for on this show. So thank you for your willingness to go there.
Thank you.
Folks, you can check out Jordan on X/Twitter at McNaughtvO, McNaughtvO, and on Instagram at McNaughtvOiceover. Jordan, again, thank you for your honesty and your willingness to go there. That's important in acting. It's also important in the disabled community. So thank you again, sir, for your willingness to go there.
Thank you so much. Thank you.